Without further ado, I just want to go ahead and introduce part of our panel. Maxine Phillips is the volunteer editor of Democratic Left, a publication of the Democratic Socialists of America, retired executive editor of Dissent magazine, and a past national director of the DSA. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to her, and she's going to introduce the rest of the panel.
Okay, hi. Thanks for coming out, everyone, and thank you to Verso. So am I close enough to the mic now? All right, great. So we're here to celebrate the publication of yet another biography of Eugene Debs, who has there's an enduring fascination with him as an American socialist. And I went to my bookshelf today and came up with something from 1948. That was, I see some people are familiar with this book. And then another book that Paul pays tribute to, which I think is one of the definitive biographies. So you see the iconic picture of Debs like that, and speaking, because he was evidently really a good speaker. But what has happened over the years with political education, I think, and we're going to hear from Nick Thorkelson about this, is the use of graphic art. So again, like here's something on wage theft that the Interfaith Worker Justice Center put out. It's in Spanish and English. It explains, excuse me, about wage theft. This was something that a group of artists put together to combat homophobia. Here's another one on May Day. This is another one of Paul Buell's on James Connolly, the leader of the Irish uprising. And this is one of Paul's favorites, I think, Johnny Appleseed, which for those of us in a certain demographic who went to summer camp, well, this tells you all the things they didn't tell you in summer camp. Then, as things get more and more sophisticated, there's even a collective of graphic artists called World War III, and they put out these volumes that are, in fact, full color, because one of the things you'll notice about the Debs biography is it's not full color. And then I just want to comment, I mean, other comics that are quite well known are full color, more than full color. They're not only full color, they're on glossy paper. And that you very rarely will see on the left. Someday, we are hoping that will happen. But in the meantime, we have to go with the power of our ideas and the power of the art. So to kick us off on the art, I'd like to introduce Nick Thorkelson. He's working with Paul, he's worked with Paul on other books, and I think some of them are here on the shelves that Verso has published. And right now you're working on a biography of Herbert Marcuse. That's correct?
It just got back from the printer.
Great. Okay. So it's called Herbert Marcuse, Philosopher of Utopia. Buy the Debs bio first, and then when that comes out. And he's contributed to a number of Paul's nonfiction comic anthologies. He was a political cartoonist at the Boston Globe, and he's done comics and cartoons in support of organizations working on economic justice, peace, and public health. He's the co-author and/or illustrator of The Earth Belongs to the People, The Underhanded History of the USA, and the comic strip of neoliberalism. And he also moonlights as a musician, songwriter, animator, graphic designer, and painter. So, Nick.
Thank you, Maxine. I'm here because Paul asked me to come, and I'm very sorry he couldn't make it. He wrote me right before I left the hotel to say that when he's sick, he can't really do serious work, so he looks to see how his books are doing. And he found an Amazon list, specialized list, I think probably something like nonfiction graphic comics, we're number one. So I'm going to, he wanted me to talk about to set some kind of a background to the idea of progressive comics, progressive squareback comics, and focusing on biographies, which you'll see have become a bigger part of his output. And so let me get right to it. Let's see if I do this. There we go. So Eugene Debs was one of the founders of the Industrial Workers of the World. The Industrial Workers of the World had this marvelous cartoonist, Ernest Reeby. We know almost nothing about him except that he did these fantastic comics. Let me see if I can quickly indicate with the laser. This is a satire on workers who do as they're told until the IWW mosquitoes come and sting them, and suddenly the alarm is set for the next shovel. A guy is looking at his output with a magnifying glass and saying that's about enough for one load, and so on. And the boss is looking at this darkening sky of IWW mosquito militants and saying, I'm going to have to raise you people's raises instead of cutting them. Later on, you'll see that I did a story about Ernest Reeby for one of the anthologies. Okay. The whole thing, in my experience, was set off by Rios, a Mexican cartoonist, very prolific, and he did. This was, I think, probably his most popular effort, Cuba for Beginners. Oh, by the way, I'm not going to go into much detail about these pictures so I can get through them. So, but we will have a Q&A later if there's something you want to talk about. The underground comics movement was not explicitly political, but it tended to be radical, and some people did very specific comics like these to promote the causes that you see on these. They call these floppies. They're just like the comic books that you would buy in a drugstore, although not on slick paper. They were all printed, had color covers and black and white insides, but they were the dimensions a little smaller than that, and stapled, saddle stitched. That's why they're called floppies. You can flop them. Paul was a big fan of the underground and its most political members, and he was also the founder and editor of Radical America, a journal that some of you might be familiar with, and he devoted an entire issue to some of the cartoonists. Gilbert Shelton, the fellow who invented the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, was the cartoonist on the ground who gathered all this group of people, including Spain Rodriguez, who you'll see later, who was the most political of the bunch. So I jumped in with my friend Jim O'Brien. Thank you. On the underhanded history of the USA, which is runs through U.S. history and undermines, as you see with the SAW, the conventional wisdom, which enough said. From Japan, this series came out from somebody who had been a commercial cartoonist in children's magazines, can somebody give me his name? Well, it doesn't matter. It was the artist was a child in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb was dropped, and he tells the extremely gruesome and dreadful story of his experiences in this series. And the first person to translate them into English and publish them in America was a fellow named Leonard Reifus, who used that logo, EduComics, for his stuff. And he also created, excuse me, a sensation with all atomic comics about nuclear power in the early 70s. And this is his response to people saying, well, we just have to have more dialogue between the companies and the consumers. Gradually, excuse me. Gradually, the radical comic migrated as serious comics tended to do to books with square backs, and these are some of my favorites. Diaspora Boy by Eli Valley, Persepolis you've probably heard of, by a woman who lived through the Iranian Revolution. Chester Brown did this. That's quite an extraordinary book anyway. The Cartoon History of the Universe by Larry Gonick, Logic Comics about Bertrand Russell, and a series of books by Joe Sacco. And not very well remembered, but really, really superb, was a Danish publication called The History Book, which is unfortunate because when you try to find anything about it on the web, a million hits that have nothing to do with this come up. But it was quite a breakthrough, and nobody's really followed up on it. But it focuses. It's the history of the world, but it focuses on slavery and imperialism, and it's extreme. It's full of great information, but it's so dramatically told about Europe's invasion of Africa. And of course, the book that put the whole thing on a whole other level is Mouse by Art Spiegelman, who is part of the underground generation, and had this idea of telling the story of the Holocaust from his father's point of view, but with the Jews as mice and the Nazis as cats. Now, this is Larry Gonick. You saw his famous book a moment ago. He and I were both struggling cartoonists in Cambridge in the early 70s, and I was working on a press service, and Larry said, "What can I do?" And I said, "We're trying to explain multinationals to the readers of the community newspapers that were using our graphics and our stories." And so he came up with this wonderful, quick and very political and pretty funny expression of that. I went to visit him late in the 70s or in the 80s, and I said, "How are things going?" He said, "I'm on a roll. My floppies about the cartoon history of the universe have now been collected in a book, and my editor is Jacqueline Onassis." And this, it's called The History of the Universe. It's really our human history, but there's some great stuff before that, and this kills me. I will be the first on land. Well, actually, there's already some bugs here. But, it doesn't matter. They won't get any credit because they don't write history books. Another one of my favorites is Joe Sacco. He did a book called Footnotes to Gaza, or I think that's right. And I was very taken by this two-page spread where you see the town in Gaza after that famous massacre. I can't think of the name of the town, but in 48 or 49, and how it looks today. He has a great gift for showing that the dreadful stories of history exist in the same world as we do. So about a little over 10 years ago, 2005, I don't have the IWW book here that Paul did with World War III, of the series of comics that Maxine showed you. Worked on that book, and he's been cranking them out at an astonishing pace ever since with various cartoonists. These are all the anthologies, which is what he mostly did at first after the IWW book. And I'll just give you a sense of them by showing you my contributions to some of these. Here you see those mosquitoes because in the story I did for the IWW book about Ernst Reby. In the Students for Democratic Society book, I told about my experience going to a student minor conference in Hazard, Kentucky, and when we released this book, Steve Max was there and told me that he was at this conference and he was part of that project. So that was pretty cool. And Steve, I think you told me that Reverend Combs looked exactly like that.
Yes, they did.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody told me that his favorite sermon was "It's easier for a camel to pass through a needle," etc. For the Beats book, I did a story about Kenneth Patchen, one of my favorite poets. For the Studs Terkel, the retelling of Studs Terkel's Working, I did the Garbage Man story and the Barber story, and it was and I worked strictly from a script by Harvey Pekar, so that was fun. For Yiddishkeit, Paul has a special interest in the avant-garde Yiddish literature of mostly from New York in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he discovered, and he taught himself Yiddish so he could come to grips with it. And he studied the works of Baruch Rivkin, who's the guy who's thinking about utopia over there on the left. He was a literary critic who championed all the best and most outlandish modernist Yiddish poets and writers who were, their day jobs where they worked in sweatshops. They were, and so naturally they were very political. I was one of 3 cartoonists to work on Radical Jesus. I used the story of a friend of mine who went to jail for hanging a banner at Draper Labs in Cambridge to talk about plowshares and the whole, that whole wing of progressive Christianity. The Radical Jesus was printed by the Mennonites, and it sank like a stone. And I guess it's because when radicals saw the word Jesus, they said, and then when Jesus people saw the word radical, they so it needed a better title, apparently. For Bohemians, which was in black and white, but I colored this because I just wanted to. I did the story of Bebop. And so, like I said, he migrated towards biographies. Let's see. The Emma Goldman book with pictures by the great Sharon Rudolph, 2007. Che by another cartoonist that I idolize, Spain Rodriguez, came out in 2008. Isadora by Sabrina Jones, who lives here in Brooklyn and is part of World War III. Excuse me, is also 2008. And Johnny Appleseed just came out a year or 2 ago. This is, if not the masterpiece, certainly a masterpiece. The story told in comics, published by Verso of Rosa Luxemburg, researched and brilliantly written and drawn by Kate Evans, a British cartoonist. And I think there's actually some other books of hers on the table there. Kate portrays. These are not facing pages, but when you come to the page on the right, you remember the page on the left. When Rosa was in prison, she wrote a letter talking about how she felt like she had the freedom to imagine herself and virtually be absolutely free and rising into the sky. And after she was bludgeoned and shot to death by the Freikorps, she was dropped from a bridge into a canal. So the release event for Red Rosa was right here in this room, and the story, which I thought I knew, was so much more powerful and affecting to me and I was getting to work on a biography of Herbert Marcuse, that kind of became the foundation of the Marcuse book, in the sense that the defeat of the Spartacist rebellion in 1919 and the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and others were founding and seminal and traumatic events in Herbert Marcuse's life, because he was part of that. He participated in that revolution as a soldier's delegate. I learned I learned a couple of things about the disposal of Rosa's body. One was that she wasn't found. Her corpse was not found until the spring. She died in the middle of the winter, and that there were burns on her wrists and feet, which indicated that she'd been weighted down with stones. So this is Herbert Marcuse, and I just want to show you a few images from that before I finish. Published by City Lights. Angela Davis kindly wrote a foreword for it. Paul Buell and Andrew Lamas, who is a professor at UPenn and very active in the Marcuse Society, were my editors. Here's somebody else going into water, but comically, another part of Marcuse's formation was that he went back to Marx and Hegel and wrote an entire book about Hegel. Many of you probably know that his great mentor was Martin Heidegger, who I thought it suddenly hit me that the ideas that attracted people like Marcuse and Hannah Arendt and these other fellows were which led to the great disillusionment when he joined the Nazi Party, were a little bit like the candy house that the witch and Hansel and Gretel offers to hopeful and hungry young people. The more I read about the institute that is the Frankfurt School, the more I thought of the Beatles. And this also expresses the idea that they strove for a collective voice, and I hope most people in this room know what that feels like and what a wonderful feeling it is when you're trying to develop your ideas. His two most influential books were Eros and Civilization and One-Dimensional Man. Here he is getting off the subway at the Common in Boston and contemplating the sexualization of the entire body. One-Dimensional Man is famous for talking about false needs and how modern capitalism sustains repression by bearing down on what people should want and what they shouldn't want. And as you probably all know, Marcuse's fame and his popularity grew to the point where he was kind of a philosophy rock star. This is him at a congress in London in 1960. I should know this, but thank you, 1967, and the cast of characters is pretty incredible. There's Allen Ginsberg, Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael, Paul Sweezy, Julian Beck, and Emmett Grogan, and so on. He was a huge influence on his student Angela Davis, and wrote her this famous letter expressing the contradictory idea in the speech balloon on the right that the philosophers of Western civilization, the very civilization that enslaved your people, were in the end only concerned with one thing. And and this is what comics can do, I think, is use the pith helmet and the balloon to conceptualize an idea like that. And this is the conclusion. There's a lot of Marcuse loved to swim, and I used that a lot in the book. And after The upper part of this page is his critique, but his belief in pleasure as the goal of revolution is the way I end the book. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Wow. So I'm sure people will have questions about your work and about the artists afterwards. But right now, Paul couldn't be here, and he really was looking forward to it. We'd been having all these email exchanges. So he wrote a little piece about what he would have said, which I will read. And the first question is, why a Gene Debs comic? Because he wasn't known as Eugene in those days. He was Gene. And he says, since my own teenage years in middle America, actually downstate Illinois, more than a half century ago, I have been drawn to the historical figure of Eugene V. Debs. It's easy to understand. Not only did he get 1 million votes as a forthright socialist and anti-war activist in 1920, he led the greatest railroad strike of the 19th century. He helped found the Industrial Workers of the World in Chicago in 1905. He traveled ceaselessly, careless of his own deteriorating health, to deliver the message of socialism. He brought working people of all kinds together and gave them hope, as well as giving them a plan for organizing. Debsian socialism is the name that many historians give to the 1900-1920 period of the U.S. left, because Debs stands for so much within it. The hundreds of local socialist newspapers in many small towns and in many languages, for instance. The deep connections with American reform and radical history that found Civil War veterans drawn to him, along with veteran activists for unions, women's suffrage, and African American rights. The commitment to socialist education, not only for people new to socialist ideas, but for socialists themselves to better understand their world so as to revolutionize it. The, quote, doctrine of Debs was and is to get outside of our comfort zones, to reach and teach all around ourselves, to become engaged in struggles directly where we can and support them from a distance where we cannot join directly. It is an international doctrine of peace and transformation around the world. So a Debs comic was natural for me, an SDS veteran of the 60s, publisher of Radical America, we saw the cover there, for SDSers and others, and historian of the left in all its varieties, with all its strengths and terrible weaknesses. And I think that is it. No. The Debs comic, sorry, my printer just ate a whole bunch of paper. And okay, the Debs comic has a definite purpose within DSA and outside. Indeed, this comic would make little sense and besides have been impossible to produce without the collaboration of fellow members. Several DSAers contributed $500 or more, and we are deeply grateful to them, especially to Jules Bernstein, whose young persona actually makes a cameo appearance in the comic. Today, we must make socialism relevant again. This is an urgent task. Nobody but us is going to do that. We do not have a lot of time to succeed, as we all know. On the other hand, we have wonderful champions like Bernie Sanders and AOC. They reach out to millions of people as we cannot by ourselves. Does the Debs comic help you to educate and organize? Well, go to the DSA Fund website. Go first to the DSA website, click on DSA Fund, and then there's a Debs comic study guide on the DSA homepage. And see if the topics and questions are relevant to you, and tell us about it. Make this comic work for the cause. So that is from Paul. So now somebody who's been working for the cause for decades is Henry Rose. And Henry has more than 30 years of experience working in labor organizing, community organizing, environmental justice campaigning, and public speaking. He is the lead program representative organizer for the New York State Nurses Association, and I think in coming days we'll be hearing a lot more about them. and their fights. He was a lead union organizer for SEIU 1199 New Jersey. For several years, he was statewide coordinator of the New Jersey Environment Justice Alliance, where he initiated strategic public policy campaigns, created educational workshops, and produced outreach materials. He is chair and founder of Blacks for Social Justice, publisher of Chincheck Newsletter, member of the People's Organization for Progress. He's published in the Black Agenda Report and Healing Black Women from Violence. A life member of the International Black Women's Congress, he created the organization's pledge and developed conference themes and has presented at numerous conferences. So we're looking forward to hearing about the labor movement and socialism.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, as an organizer, it's a rare day for an audience this small. I need a microphone. But having said that, I am a bit sick. So if my voice cracks, realize that I am not undergoing a secondary puberty. But instead it is indeed the cold that's bringing me here. And I want to thank the organizers and of course yourself for taking moments out of your day to being able to come out, and these are the only way things will ever be built, is if we take a moment and spend time together and get away from what we have in our daily life. So I just want to thank you, and please give yourself a hand. I've been given the monumental task of attempting to, at least in part, bring you to the fountain of thought and practice. That was Eugene Victor Debs, and extract meaningful elements of that thought and practice that I thought would be meaningful and relevant for you and I and all of us today. Any flaws in what I say are my own, and let us give praise to Debs for that which goes well. And I want to say that I use the word fountain purposefully because Debs' thought is both deep and broad, and so I humbly ask that you and I grab a glass or a cup or a thermos or a goblet so that we can take some of Debs, some of his thought home with us. And I was just trying to mess with the analogy. So anyway, there are 5 core pillars of Debs' thought that I chose to highlight that I believe speaks to us at this moment. Those core pillars are interconnected, interwoven, and mutually reinforcing. Because of time constraints, I will only explore the first 3 of these pillars in depth, but I thought it was needed and necessary to name the 5. They are as follows: the inevitability and necessity of class struggle, a willingness to challenge institutional arrangements in favor of the working class. I'm sorry, that's 2. That working class self-organization is the central pillar of both socialism and the labor movement. That there is a need for a consistent ideology among the working class to move forward. And Debs also, I think, had a profound view on the necessity of Americanizing radicalism. Central to the mature thought of Eugene Victor Debs, and the foundation upon which all the other pillars sit, is the inevitable nature of class struggle under capitalism. Debs believed, and dare I say so much we, that the nature of capitalism degrades the human, and it must be defeated, full stop. That this degradation is inherent in the system itself because, as Martin Luther King reminded us, capitalism thinifies people and turns human beings into objects to make profit from, without recognizing the inherent dignity and worth and nobility that we all possess. Capitalism then divides, as we all know, human beings between those who do the work and those that capture the benefits of the work, creating a polarization with wealth, health, education, leisure time on the one hand, and poverty and despair on the other. If capitalism serves as a means of social domination, then the laws of social physics say that where there's oppression, there's got to be resistance. And the labor movement and socialism and the rise of DSA and the way that people are now deeply looking at socialism, where socialism is, at least among the younger generation, seems to be more popular than capitalism. We shall see how long that lasts. But at least at this moment, they're there. And lest we forget, the earth itself is rebelling against its degradation under capitalism. Because let's not fool ourselves that climate change is the earth rebelling, saying to stop extracting from me, stop pulling from me, stop treating me like an object, as though the earth itself is not alive. The second pillar of Debsian thought, see, I'm trying to be like an intellectual and use the word Debsian. I was to speak to you about is the necessity to challenge institutional arrangements in favor of the working class. Debs himself split with any group that he felt was, instead of practicing class struggle, was engaged and practiced class snuggle. Thusly, Debs broke with the AFL, broke with the Democratic Party, defied the Socialist Party in backing the IWW. Debs continually called craft unionism out because he felt that it created divisions among the working class. And he spoke about one group being on strike and another group of the working class working in the same place going to work. And even now that exists. And as an organizer for the New York State Nurses Association, 1199 got a contract, and we are 3 weeks away from a strike. And they'll be in the building and we'll be outside. Forgive me. Debs ultimately believed in and stood firmly upon a full emancipation of the working class. Not changing some of the conditions, not we're gonna make it a little better, not we're gonna give you $1 or $2 more, but the emancipation of working class people from capitalism, and the creation of then a new world and new social order for us to look forward to. And the third and last plank of Debs that I thought that I wanted to touch on today is the necessity for self-organization of the working class. That nobody but the working class will save the working class. And that Debs believed that the working class had the capacity, the ability, the intellectual powers, the ultimate responsibility and right to free themselves from capitalism itself. And I was working with 10 minutes, so I'm almost done. But in end of this, I just want to talk to people about a redemption of the world historical working class centered vision of Eugene Victor Debs. Because Eugene Debs stands redeemed even today because, as he said, two classes are at war, and every day of truce is at the expense of labor. That there can be no peace or goodwill between these two essentially antagonistic economic classes, nor can this class conflict be covered up or smoothed over. And so let us not smooth them over or cover them up. He told us that it was beyond comprehension to imagine a fox and goose peace conference sitting at the same table, where the goose lifts its wing and the fox says, "Let us pray." P-R-E-Y, pray, of course.
Sure.
Last page here. And I'm not even sure where I was.
Let us pray.
Let us not, that much I knew. P-R-E-Y, pray. Debs, and I just wanted to talk about Debs, he spoke about the old unionism, and he said the old unionism is organized upon the basis of identity of interest in the capitalists and the working class. And that it's clear now that when going to petition a capitalist Congress or court to rule against the other is like a flock of sheep petitioning a pack of wolves to extract their own things. And yet how many times do we find ourselves hoping and praying that Congress is going to do something, that the courts will save us? Far too often. Lastly, Debs, on the emancipation of the working class, said that too long have workers of the world waited for some Moses to lead them out of bondage. He said there's no hope for us in this system. And we're beginning to realize this fact, and so we're beginning to organize. And we are no longer relying upon someone else, but we are making up their own minds. And I'm sorry, he said there, I said we, because he's talking about the working class. And even though I got on a pink tie, I'm still part of it, you know. So I just wanted to say that on this March 7th, that Debs has pointed us forward in a way towards revolutionary transformation, and once again, we in the working class are back at it. And you know the day the fight ends? When we win. That's it.
Well, thank you, Henry. That is in the tradition of Eugene Debs. And I think we're hearing, as you said, more and more of this now, and it is falling on very receptive ears. So our last speaker, and then we'll, kind of open it up. We'll open up the floor, and then we'll have the speakers respond, is Steve Max, who also has a long history in civil rights and anti-war and union organizing. He has trained organizers at the Midwest Academy since 1973 and is the co-author with Kim Bobo of Organizing for Social Change. And in the last presidential election, he was also the congressional district coordinator for Bernie Sanders. And Steve and his wife Lynn and I were out there. I mean, they were out there all the time. I was out there occasionally, handing out stuff and signing up voters and exhorting voters. So, exhort.
Thank you. So we've heard about the function of the book in bringing Debs to a larger public. We've heard about it in relation to unions. I want to talk about it a little bit in relation to socialist organizing and DSA in specific. But before I do, just so I'll know whether to say we or they, how many people here are in DSA? And how many are in some other socialist organization? Well, it's kind of split down the middle. I'm going to say we, and those of you who aren't in DSA can join it then at the end of the meeting. So one of the things that we wanted to accomplish with the book, the graphic biography, was to show that many of the strategic questions facing socialists right now are not unlike those that socialists have faced over the last century, that nothing is ever entirely new, and while circumstances change dramatically, the strategic questions remain. For example, does work in a major political party enhance our organization or distract from it? Is reform within capitalism the road to the socialist future or the enemy of it? Do rich and poor women have more in common with each other than working class men and women have in common with each other? Now, questions like these and many others have occurred throughout the history of socialism, and the answers to these, like the answers to almost everything, is it depends. It depends on the circumstances, and that is because the answers to these very questions have been both yes and no at various times and at different places in history. It isn't a matter of avoiding what didn't work in the past, nor is it repeating what did work. Either could be right or wrong today. And we hope that this book will encourage socialists to ask, what were the economic, political, and demographic conditions that caused any particular strategy to succeed or fail in the past, and precisely what has changed that might make it succeed or fail today? It was the revolutionary leader Lenin who observed that before the working class got the vote, socialist strategy was fairly straightforward. All you really needed to do, he said, was to advocate revolution, because there was no other way that social change could come about in undemocratic or feudal countries. And while the strategy was clear, outside of Russia, less so were the tactics for actually carrying out a revolution, and that was often where the trouble began. Lenin went on to say that improvements such as the 8-hour day, the minimum wage, or free public schools, which had previously been thought only possible under socialism, now became possible under capitalism when the working class got the vote. And working people often found that that prospect of having those changes under capitalism was far more appealing than waiting for an uncertain and distant revolution. During the periods of the two Roosevelts, Teddy and Franklin, socialists complained bitterly that the capitalist parties had stolen their program. But what exactly was the point? Did we put out our program precisely so that it could be stolen and parts of it enacted to benefit working people? Or did we hope the program would be ignored so that we could say, "Told you so"? And under what set of circumstances are people more likely to join our organization? Is it when our program moves into the mainstream, or when it sits on the altar of purity in the temple of the left? Now, it wasn't just Debs who complained that the socialist program was being stolen, and we talk in the book about it. Norman Thomas said that Roosevelt stole it, and so did Harry Truman steal it in 1948. And Mike Harrington certainly thought that Lyndon Johnson had stolen large parts of it in 1964, particularly Medicare, Medicaid, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, immigration reform, and the Economic Opportunity Act. Now, Harrington was pleased that it had been stolen because he wasn't running for president on that platform and wasn't going to lose votes because of it. But the paradox was this: both Truman and Johnson were war criminals in the most literal sense of the term. What should socialists have done? Pressed harder for even more reform, or demand that these presidents be tried and punished for the mass murder of civilians in Japan, Hiroshima, and in Vietnam? Now, I know what we in the movement of the 60s did. We drove Johnson from office, thereby saving the moral soul of America. But in the process, we tore apart the Democratic Party and got Richard Nixon in return, for which nobody but the Republicans thanked us, least of all the tens of thousands of people of color who found employment in government-funded anti-poverty programs, which then ended. In addition, the unions were alienated from the left in a way that took almost 30 years to repair. Now, I know that we were right in opposing the war, and we were right in supporting the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. But there were consequences, and some socialists at that time were not so sure. Questions that Debs, Thomas, and Mike Harrington had faced arose again during the Obama administration. Do we praise the first African American president and stand with those who rejoiced at his victory, or attack him for timidity and for allowing the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to invade and destroy Libya, which the United Nations said had the highest humanity index in Africa, meaning it was the most humane society by broad measurements? And unfortunately, Libya sat on an ocean of nationalized oil, which the US, Britain, and France wanted. In the book, we talk about one of my favorite socialists, Victoria Woodhull. Were she sitting here today, she would fit right in with the rest of us. She was thoroughly modern in our terms and totally outspoken in her attitudes toward socialism, gender equality, racial equality, and even monogamy, or preferably, as she thought, the absence of it. She was the first woman to run for president and the first to start her own Wall Street brokerage and one of the first to start her own weekly newspaper. The problem was that it was 1873, And when she brought a large number of young American-born, equally modern socialists into the predominantly German immigrant International Working Men's Association, a name which you know from Karl Marx, she and her members were all subsequently expelled for expressing social views that alienated the industrial workers of that time. What would we as socialists have done? Would we have totally agreed with her then as we do now? Her views really did alienate the very people that the International Working Men's Association saw as its conspiracy. And I know how easy it is for that to happen. When I was organizing coal miners in Perry County, Kentucky, there were wives who would not let their husbands attend our meetings because one of our staff wore very, very short skirts. What should I, as the project director, have done? Today, in that vein, we want to work with Latino immigrants, but many of them, devout Catholics, hold very different views from ours on abortion and even gender equality. So what do we say about those issues? Of course, the answers aren't in the back of the book. Only the historical parallels are in the book, and you have to find them yourselves. But if we have helped to keep the memory of Debs alive, for the authors, that is reward enough. Beyond that, though, if the next generation of socialists realizes that knowing who you are and where you came from is essential to knowing where you're going and how to get there, then we will have truly succeeded.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So let's see. I think we have, 20 minutes or so, and then we want to encourage everyone to buy the book and to schmooze. But let's have some questions. I am going to, this being a left-wing group, you know what's coming. We are going to limit people to 2 minutes each. So, okay, gentleman there.
Steve, what do you do about that short skirt?
Excuse me. Could you identify yourself too? And then,
Eric Starr.
What did I do about the short skirt? Okay, well, you saw the cartoon.
I'm supposed to say it into the microphone. What, Steve? What did you do about the short skirt?
You saw the cartoon. You saw Reverend Combs. The only thing that was inaccurate about the picture is that the people in the room weren't on their knees, because when Reverend Combs, who was one of the leaders of the miners in our group, opened the meeting and closed the meeting with prayer, you were on your knees. What I did was, well, let me say another thing. In that community, almost nobody had indoor toilets. Almost nobody had hot running water. I knew of only 2 people who had working TV sets. They couldn't afford them, there was no cable, and they didn't get good reception anyway. So they had no idea what the styles were in the outside world, or what people were wearing, or of fashion. They only knew what they wore. What did I do? I said to the young woman, you know, we're trying to bring more decorum and formality to these community meetings. We've introduced written agendas. We try to start and end on time. And it would help us move forward with that if you would sit with me behind the table rather than sitting cross-legged on the floor. So I cut the middle path there.
yeah, I saw someone. Yeah. Okay, if you tell us who you are and ask, and whether it's directed to one panelist or to everyone.
So my name is Natalie James. I'm a DSA member and founder of the DSA Queer Caucus, and I often wear a coat with a Eugene Debs button that lists his prisoner number, where he was locked up, presumably after giving his anti-World War I participation speech. And I wanted to know from the panel, from any panelist that's comfortable with answering, how you would address the issue of Eugene Debs' ties to DSA. Like, how do you draw that line? I know the Socialist Party obviously was a formative, component of DSA, but in terms of DSA's claims to Eugene Debs, how would you summarize that?
Start with that.
Sure. Debs' tie to socialism in general, where we are now. And I don't know whether you can make a specific to say, though Debs was Democratic and a socialist, and that the Socialist Party at least differed from the Communist Party in a lot of ways that DSA may be closer to. But I'm not sure it's worth the argument with people. What's the program we're working on? Can we agree on this? I think that Debs belongs probably to all socialists, and that it may not be worth your time spending too much time on that. I don't know.
Nick, do you have any thoughts? Or?
No.
Steve?
Well, I go by the theory of epithelial transfer, the epithelial tissue on your fingertips. And so what matters is who you shook hands with. Now, I shook hands with Mike Harrington. And Mike Harrington shook hands with Max Shachtman. And Max Shachtman shook hands with Leon Trotsky. And Trotsky shook hands with Lenin, and Lenin shook hands with Plekhanov, and Plekhanov shook hands with Engels, who shook hands with Karl Marx. So we are directly connected straight back. And as was said, there is a linear organizational connection as well, right? Each of these successors to the Socialist Party that Debs was a leader of eventually ends up in DSA. And so we claim that entire ancestry quite legitimately.
Okay, Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Bennett. I'm the chair of the DSA Fund, and we were very pleased to be one of the sponsors for this book, which I had a chance to read, and it's really great. I had a question, I guess mostly for Steve, but for whoever else wants to join in. This wasn't exactly just a straightforward biography, because there's been those, that it was more interested in kind of connecting Debs to a movement. So, for instance, we don't hear as much about his relationship with his wife, or it doesn't even mention when he died. It kind of just goes straight to the inheritance into Norman Thomas and Michael Harrington and Bernie Sanders. So I was wondering how you balance, in approaching a project like this, and many of you worked on these kind of projects, not wanting to have a cult of personality around one individual and wanting to see them as part of a movement, but also kind of looking at the facts of their lives.
I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
I guess I'm asking how you balance kind of traditional biography with looking at this person as almost more an exemplar of a movement, and if that's a difficult balance or...
Well, there were two different angles that we came at this at. Now, Paul believes that, and I agree with him, that the movement needs a mythology. The socialist movement needs its own mythology, its own culture. It needs heroes who are larger than life. It needs expressions in the arts and music and so on. And that we have to, that all past successful radical movements have had those, and we've kind of lost it, and that our job is to recreate it, right? And so Debs is painted much larger than life. Now, my own point of view is that what the movement needs is economic analysis and a strong dose of dialectical and historical materialism. And so the book comes out somewhere in between, although what's in between those 2 points on the spectrum is a little closer to Jesus than some of you might be comfortable with. That's how we wound up with this image of Debs.
Right, and if you read the review that's on the homepage of DSA right now, you'll find some disagreement with that view of the great man theory and so on. But I do have to say, I mean, just listening to the quotes, I mean, I'm sure he was the complex person that we might expect, but he also evidently inspired a lot of people. And Paul was always in the email exchanges talking about, well, I know this sounds really sappy, but people love to give him flowers, and he kissed their babies, and that was a different time. Now, for Paul, well, we won't even go into it, but there was another question. Yeah, no, the man in the brown shirt, and then we'll, yeah.
Hi, my name is Duncan. I'm from Toronto, Ontario. My question is for Steve, although it's open to anyone on the panel who could answer it. You started by talking about one of the sort of overarching and never-ending discussions or conflicts between to what extent do you work within the system to try and work on like real gains for working people. And in the context of Bernie Sanders, obviously he's chosen in a real way to work within the system, although to try and maintain a certain independence within that system at the same time. And I'm wondering if you could offer your thoughts on the extent to which, by working within the system, and he seems to have a realistic shot of actually winning the presidency in 2020, he's in some ways, the front runner for the Democratic nomination, that he could actually, within the current system, deliver on the kind of socialist politics and values that he has worked within or tried to exemplify, and that he has said he believes in, and to the extent to which that could actually implement some of the things that Eugene Debs himself worked for. And I know Bernie Sanders, I think he did like an audio biography of Debs at one point, so he's obviously one of Bernie's heroes. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and anyone else on the panel who might be able to touch on that too.
So we should understand that Sanders' conception of socialism is not exactly the same as DSA's, because it doesn't include the nationalization of large parts of the economy, which is part of what we socialists look for and think is necessary. So that Sanders is looking for how far can you push reform within the system without changing the underlying economic relationships of it. And that fits in with what many progressive people want, and many working people want. They want both to have the market, and they want to be protected from the logical consequences of the market, right? Which seems contradictory, but nobody said that a person's head can't hold contradictory thoughts at the same time. So whether Bernie can succeed depends on who else succeeds with him, right? If we get more left people into Congress, if we take back the Senate, we can certainly get the Sanders program. We can get single payer, we can get free higher education, we can get paid family leave, we can get universal child care, we can get the $15 minimum wage, which we already have in New York State, made national. That level of change we can certainly get.
I think it's necessary for us to keep an inside-out perspective to be sure that we organize ourselves and not wait on a Moses or Sanders to take us forward, but instead that if one of the things that the Obama era showed us is that if you do not have an independent force of people to push them forward, somebody I know once said it's hard to live in a whorehouse and not hurt children.
Could I ask a really quick follow-up question? Would that be okay?
Pardon?
Could I ask a really quick follow-up question? Is that okay?
Yeah, short.
Yeah, very quick.
I'm just.
Do you think Sanders is meaningfully a socialist, or is he just a social democratic politician who identifies as a socialist, or is that not a useful question?
I don't know the answer to it.
Okay, I think there were some people in the back. Okay, see, the one way in the back, and then we'll go to the yellow shirt.
Thanks. Yeah. So my name's Ted Matrakis. I'm an educator, and I guess I would just first say that I was a history major in college. Never heard about Debs. I always ask my students in classes if they've heard of Debs. No one's ever heard of him. So why has he been so completely erased from our education? That's kind of troubling. Anyone cover Debs in school? No one. Okay. Some of you did. Well, for the most part, we didn't. And I guess I would just ask you to respond to this point that, who sent Debs to prison? It wasn't a right-wing Republican, it was the liberal Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Just like today, who stood in the way of Bernie Sanders? It was the liberal Democrat Hillary Clinton. So we have to be very cognizant of the fact that the greatest enemies of socialism have always been, Democrats. And that has to continue to be pointed out. And to me, that's one of the messages of Debs that we should take with us. So that's just something I thought I'd throw out there and ask you to respond to the panel in general.
You would think that people erase Debs from history as they erase many radical figures from their I mean, this was not secret. They don't want you to know. Therefore, we're not going to tell you. And if we don't keep their names alive and we don't teach them to expect them to be taught within system, maybe you expect it a bit much.
I did have a high school teacher who mentioned Debs to us. He said, this guy, he ran for president from prison. Wouldn't that have been something if we had a jailbird as the president? That's possibly the first I heard of Debs. As opposed to, can you believe that he got, what, 1 million votes?
Almost 1 million, yeah.
But Paul does a lot of work on the history of the left, the social history of the left and its strength in immigrant communities. And you know, the enemies of socialism and the champions of capitalism have done a lot to erase Debs from our consciousness, but upward mobility has also played a part. Those immigrant communities for various reasons, had trouble passing on the faith as their children got in on the system and received some benefits from it because of reforms which you know, as like Henry said, inside out. The fear of socialism led to reforms that made it hard to keep socialism as a fighting faith alive in families, which is how faiths are usually kept alive.
Well, I'll just add my own personal story, which was that when I was young, Norman Thomas was still around. I mean, you know, he was occasionally mentioned in newspapers, and people talked about, you know, this third party and how useless it was. And my dad said, well, yeah, I voted for him in 1932, and then afterward, FDR had the whole program, so why would I waste my time on a third party? And it was only after I joined DSOC, Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, that I found out that my grandfather had voted for Debs. I mean, that's how much that history was submerged. Because, I mean, we haven't even begun to talk about the Red Scares and the complete annihilation, obliteration of these movements. The United States has one of the most repressive histories. You know, we may have been taught about things that happened in Europe, but we didn't learn about what happened here. And sometimes when you do see, I remember going to a meeting and seeing a documentary about Mother Jones, and there were heaps of bodies, of miners' bodies from a struggle. Nobody ever mentioned that. You know, there might have been, oh, there were these strikes out west, and that was it. And nobody talked about the body count. Okay, Tom, I think. No, did we get you in the yellow shirt with it? Okay, all right.
So,
yeah.
So, I'm Tom Roderick, full disclosure, Maxine's husband. Mr. Rose, I was interested in what you said about the earth resisting being exploited in the same way workers need to resist being exploited. And just wondering if Eugene Debs acknowledged the derangement of the earth and the environment at all, and how you think socialists today should be bringing that into their priorities.
I don't know what Debs thought about environmental degradation, and I don't want to sit here and BS those like I do. I am a minor Debs scholar, and would far rather give it over to somebody who knows better than that. What socialists should be doing today, I mean, if people don't stand for the earth, the calamities that are approaching us, we know are going to take place. They're going to predominantly hit working class people. I think that we have to keep on with the socialist movement moving forward. socialism's thinkers believing that the extent to which industrialization was necessary for socialism to take place, I think we need to rethink that. I mean, we're already industrialized, but got to rethink that somewhat, and not join with the capitalists in the plunder of the earth. And I think that's probably about as good as I can give you.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. All right, yeah.
Just two quick thoughts on that. One is that what I think socialists should not do at this time is say that the only two alternatives are socialism and the end of the world, because that then changes the subject from the environment, if that's what you were talking about, and makes people wonder if it's not all hopeless. But I think in the shorter run, the fight is against market-based solutions to environmental problems, such as the carbon tax and trade. There's a whole school, and it's almost the dominant school in climate change, that says that if you just make it profitable enough for corporations to not pollute, they won't. And that's the way to go, and that's what legislation should be aimed at. And many of those remedies have been tried in Europe and other parts of the world. We know they don't work, so we have to resist the market-based solutions and say that you just outlaw this stuff, right? I mean, tax, cap and trade, well, let me not get into the details of it, just to say that we want to resist capitalist solutions by trying to enrich corporations.
Okay, so I will indulge in a shameless plug right now. Democratic Left, the magazine of the Democratic Socialists of America, just went online this morning, and the theme is the Green New Deal. So some of the things, and Steve hasn't even read it yet, but some of those same themes are in that. Okay, I think there was, yeah, now. Tom, do you want to give him that?
Hi, my name is E. Keenan. I'm an employee rights lawyer. My question is directed primarily to Mr. Rose, but also to anybody on the panel who wants to answer. One of the things you'd spoken about and that Debs emphasized, and I think is kind of a continuing issue we struggle with on the left, is the extent that this idea of a Moses and the idea of people who are not themselves the workers that we hope will organize, trying to be the head of the spear, kind of vanguard of the proletariat. I think about this myself a lot as a lawyer, and I imagine in this audience, we have academics, we have other people who are not on the shop floor, in a sense, and it often seems like the conversation on the left is being led more by people who are the vanguard, if you will, but not themselves the people who are trying to, or we hope will gain power. This isn't really a specific question. It's more just kind of a prompt for discussion. What's kind of your current thinking about dealing with that issue on the left? And what role do people who are academics, lawyers, et cetera, have, if any, and I hope we do have a role, in class struggle?
He's asking if we should kill all the lawyers.
We know what Shakespeare thinks, but...
I mean, so the Moses syndrome, or the syndrome of somebody leading you out of this, at least in part, and I deal with it as an organizer in places where people are like, you should make this happen, or I'm in the public hospital system often, and people are like, oh, why haven't you won safe staffing? And I tell people all the time that it would probably take about $1 billion, and if I could get $1 billion myself, I'm not sure I would share it with you. But that the working class also isn't perfect, and people look for shortcuts. And so while relying on believing in and working to build a working class, we also have to realize that there's problematics there. People can be less than kind to one another, can be short-sighted, can be greedy, And of course, I think that we who are no longer on the shop floor still have a role to play, and yet it's when do we lead and when do we fall back? And can we lead from behind and put our hands in people's backs and push them forward? And I am not quite sure at this moment that we can explore it much further.
Okay, well,
Just a quick.
oh, yeah, so I'm sorry.
Do we have time? We don't have time, just tell me.
Yeah, I think Wes, how are we doing on time? One or two more questions. Okay, so.
Well, no, we'll take another question.
Okay, so Miriam and then there was somebody in the back, right, who'd been trying. Okay, but Miriam, why don't?
I'm sorry. I'm Miriam, and I've been in DSA on and off for many decades. So I was thinking about Steve's comments about the forever tension between achieving reforms that deliver immediate gains and fighting for the revolution. And I thought it would be interesting to hear Steve and Max, and if you also want to give any comments about how you balance that in your own organizing over time. The change, immediate wins, and not make people therefore complacent, but want to go further.
I'll jump in first.
Okay.
I think I don't think winning gains makes people complacent. I think it gives them courage, and it's always worthwhile.
Yeah, well, I'm a community organizer by profession, and we always have to start with winning immediate gains. That's the only thing that keeps people in the fight, you know. And we joke about stop sign issues, right? But we saw it on our own block, where Lynn with the Block Association led the fight for a stop sign, and then people said, well, if we can get that, we can get a traffic light. Right. Now that doesn't keep going from the traffic light all the way to socialism, right? And that's where academics and lawyers and those folks come in, right? To one, keep us out of prison, the lawyers, while the academics create some of the theoretical framework that we need to go forward with. But you have to have victories. If you don't have victories, people say it's all impossible. People are not apathetic, right? They're smart, and we're not the first folks who have showed up with a program, right? With 100th, and they've seen it not work, and so they don't want to put time into it and believe it. And so we have to show that something works, and that's why we're constantly trying to do it. It's not up to us whether we have a revolutionary perspective or a reform perspective, right? It's up to the people who we are trying to influence, what they want, right? It's up to them. Now, we've heard Debs paraphrased a number of times that I won't lead you into the promised land because if I could, somebody else could lead you out. I would be willing to take that risk if I could lead people into the promised land. So far, we haven't succeeded, but I think we can try, and we need figures who can move us forward that way.
I mean, I guess I would, as I think on American history for the most part, it would seem that the left and leftist views are actually stronger when their victory is taking place. I mean, and I am a child of the 60s for real, but I think of the Reagan era. And in Reagan, we were kind of beat down. I think that we've done much better when there are Democrats, and they don't necessarily have to be progressives, but something resembling a liberal who makes some kind of, who has some conversation about and some program about the aspirations of the people in such a way that they raise hopes that people think another possibility exists. And so I think that then it's necessary for us, and it kind of goes back to Bernie, is that if Bernie wins, there will be a level of interest and commitment that we then need to take and push forward to the best of our ability as far as we can go, and can't go but so much further further than the people, or you will be out there by yourself, and we'll see what happens.
Exactly so.
Okay, so I think we had one more in the back. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Scott Wordsman. I'm an adjunct professor. I was curious about what you think the future of the labor union is. I feel like we live in a really strange and divisive time where like the language of liberal capitalism kind of puts the blame and the onus on the individual, and it really atomizes the individual, so the worker feels like, oh, there's no solidarity, I'm competing with my fellow worker, what's the point of joining a union? My own parents kind of actually convinced me not to join the adjuncts union because it's like, why, you're being paid such a paltry amount, why would you pay $200 into such a feudal system? And I was like, wow, it's really shot. I feel like 7%, I read like 6 or 7% of American workers are in unions. So do you feel like it's kind of a system that needs an overhaul, or if it's just totally screwed? Just curious.
Well, we could start here. Nick, you got thought. We've lived through different times.
I don't have much of substance to say. It is socialism has been so intimately connected to union strength in its entire history, and I think we have to look at this as a new situation. We have foxes running the hen house in terms of any kind of government relation with unions, and they've suffered accordingly. And I'm not a strategist. I don't know what to do with that.
Well, there is an overhaul, and this is what I think what it comes to. There was a logic to the previous phases of trade unionism. Craft union members believed that if they could get together and set the rate and not undercut each other, and if they could maintain a labor scarcity of a particular skill by limiting apprenticeships, that supply and demand would keep wages higher, and they didn't really have to engage in fighting the boss. And to a large extent, that was true for a period of time. So there was a logic to it. There was a logic to industrial unionism when workers realized that they could stop the machines. There's a logic to public sector unionism where you can vote for your boss, and politics plays a large role. Right now we're looking at a new kind of workforce that isn't any of those things. Right? It's the knowledge worker. And how do you organize them, and how do you appeal to them, and even where is the workplace? Is it in their living room? Is it here? Where is it? We don't even know. That's the next phase that we have to address and try to figure out how those folks can be brought together. In many cases, it's not even clear who the employer is with them.
So, I always try to make a delineation between the labor union and the labor movement. And that the unions, their shape and function at this time is severely challenged. I think the other thing that we have to remember is that the working class is international. And that what's taking place here in the United States is not necessarily a microcosm of what's going on in the world. And that the proletariat still exists, though they're shrinking in the United States of America. But I think that it's necessary for us to actually be real about internationalism and not stand on other people's backs. Because if you can continually be pitted, whipsawed, one against the other, sooner or later you lose anyway. So I just think that we need to look internationally, that the labor movement, to me, is a class struggle. That until capitalism goes away, the labor movement won't. Labor unions, we'll see. I mean, I got about 15 years till I retire, so if I can go ahead and see that out for right now. No, but seriously.
Okay, well, as we've seen, these questions, Eugene Debs lived in a time of incredible inequality, and we too live in that time. And they're often the same questions, but I think it was it Marx who said you can't step in the same stream twice, or what? Okay, all right. But anyway, you can't. So what we have to come up with is our own brand of socialism and our own way of fighting, but the struggle continues. And thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to Verso. Thank you to the speakers. Very, very, I learned a lot, and I really appreciate it. And buy the book, download the study guide, talk to your friends and neighbors, and we'll be having webinars on the website. If you didn't get your question answered tonight, there will be times to talk to Paul once he gets his voice back, and to Steve, who never seems to lose his voice. Thank you all, and have some wine.